When a blizzard strands a headstrong woman and the man she despises in a remote frontier inn with only one room left, he makes a ruthless call that changes everything. Then we're engaged. What starts as a lie to survive the night becomes a dangerous game neither can control, forcing them into a fake engagement that feels far too real. Trapped by snow, scandal, and secrets, Clara Bennett must decide. Trust the cold strategist who suddenly won't let her out of his sight, or risk everything she's built. Stay until the end to see how this storm rewrites their fate. Drop a comment with your city. Let's see who's watching from where. The storm came without mercy. Clara Bennett pressed her gloved hand against the frosted carriage window, watching the world outside dissolve into white chaos. Snow fell in thick, violent sheets, swallowing the narrow frontier road whole. The horses struggled forward, their breath steaming in ragged bursts, hooves slipping on ice that had formed too fast for the driver to notice. She had left the capital 3 days ago with one goal: reach the northern settlement before winter locked the roads. Her father's business dealings there couldn't wait, and Clara had volunteered to make the journey when no one else would. It was reckless, maybe, but she'd spent her entire life being careful, being proper, being the daughter who never caused trouble. And where had that gotten her? Nowhere. So here she was, alone in a hired carriage, racing against a storm that didn't care about schedules or propriety. "Miss Bennett," the driver's voice cut through the howling wind. "We need to stop. The road ahead. It's blocked." Clara leaned forward, squinting through the snow. A massive pine tree lay across the narrow path, its branches tangled with debris from the cliffs above. The storm had torn it down like kindling. "Can we go around?" she called back. "Not safely. And there's another storm front coming in behind this one. If we don't find shelter now, we won't make it through the night." Clara's chest tightened. She glanced at the small travel bag beside her. Barely enough supplies for one more day. The nearest town was still hours away, assuming the road didn't get worse. "There's an inn," the driver continued, his voice strained. "About a mile east. It's not much, but it'll have to do." Clara nodded, swallowing her frustration. "Then take us there." The carriage lurched forward, veering off the main road onto a narrower trail that cut through dense pine forest. The trees provided some relief from the wind, but the snow was relentless. Clara pulled her cloak tighter, trying to ignore the cold seeping through the walls. She hated this, hated being at the mercy of weather, of circumstance, of men who made decisions for her because they assumed she couldn't handle the truth. But she'd prove them wrong. She always did. The inn appeared like a ghost through the storm, a low timber structure with smoke rising from its chimney. It looked ancient, half buried in snow, with narrow windows that glowed faintly from within. The sign above the door read Blackwood Lodge, though the letters were nearly invisible beneath ice. The driver pulled the horses to a stop, then climbed down to help Clara descend. The moment her boots hit the ground, the wind nearly knocked her over. She stumbled, catching herself against the carriage, her breath freezing in her lungs. "Go inside," the driver urged. "I'll see to the horses." Clara didn't argue. She pushed through the snow toward the entrance, her legs trembling from cold and exhaustion. The door was heavy, old wood reinforced with iron, and it took all her strength to shove it open. Warmth hit her like a wall. The interior of the inn was dimly lit, crowded, and chaotic. A massive stone fireplace dominated one side of the room, its flames roaring as travelers huddled close for warmth. Tables were crammed with people, merchants, laborers, families, all stranded by the storm. The air smelled of wet wool, wood smoke, and something cooking in the back kitchen. Clara stepped inside, shaking snow from her cloak. Every head turned toward her. She was used to being stared at. A woman traveling alone always drew attention, but here, in a place like this, the looks felt different, sharper, more calculating. She ignored them and moved toward the front desk, where a grizzled innkeeper stood tallying coins. "I need a room," Clara said, keeping her voice steady. The innkeeper didn't look up. "We're full. I'll pay double." "Still full." Clara's patience snapped. "I've been traveling for 3 days. There's a storm outside that could kill me if I go back out there. So unless you want my death on your conscience, find me a room." The innkeeper finally looked up, his expression unreadable. He studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "There's one room left, but it's already spoken for." "Then unspeak for it." "Can't. The man who reserved it is sitting right over there." The innkeeper nodded toward the far corner of the room. Clara followed his gaze, and her stomach dropped. Darian Wolfe. Of course. Of all the people in the world to be stranded with, it had to be him. Darian sat alone at a corner table, a glass of whiskey in one hand, a book in the other. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall, lean, with sharp features that seemed carved from stone. His dark hair was slightly damp from the storm, and his coat, expensive, tailored, was draped over the back of his chair. He hadn't noticed her yet. Or if he had, he didn't care. Clara's jaw tightened. She'd last seen Darian 6 months ago, at a dinner party in the capital. He'd spent the entire evening ignoring her, speaking only to her father about business contracts and investment opportunities. He was cold, ruthless, and insufferably arrogant, a man who valued logic over emotion and saw people as assets to be managed. She despised him, and now, apparently, she needed him. Clara crossed the room, weaving between tables until she reached his corner. Darian didn't look up. "I need the room," she said flatly. Darian turned a page in his book. "No, I wasn't asking, and I wasn't offering." He took a sip of whiskey, still not looking at her. "Find somewhere else." "There is nowhere else. The inn is full." "Then you should have arrived earlier." Clara's hands curled into fists. "You're really going to let me freeze to death out of spite?" "I'm going to let you figure out your own problems." Darian finally glanced up, his pale gray eyes meeting hers with icy indifference. "You're resourceful, Miss Bennet. I'm sure you'll manage." For a moment, Clara considered throwing his whiskey in his face. But that would only prove his point, that she was impulsive, emotional, incapable of controlling herself. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she leaned forward, planting her hands on the table. "Fine. Keep your room. But when I'm found frozen in a ditch tomorrow morning, I hope you sleep well knowing you could have prevented it." She turned to leave, but Darian's voice stopped her. "Wait." Clara glanced back. Darian was watching her now, his expression unreadable. "You're serious," he said slowly. "You have nowhere else to go." Brilliant deduction. Darian set down his glass, his gaze flicking toward the crowded room. Clara followed his line of sight and realized what he was seeing, the way the other men were watching her, the way their eyes lingered too long, calculating whether she was worth the risk. A woman alone in a place like this wasn't safe. Darian's jaw tightened, just barely. Then he stood, buttoning his coat with sharp, efficient movements. "Come with me." Clara blinked. "What?" "The room. We'll share it." "Absolutely not." "Then enjoy the storm." Darian moved past her toward the stairs. Clara's mind raced. Sharing a room with Darian Wolfe was the last thing she wanted. But the alternative, spending the night down here surrounded by strangers who looked at her like prey, was worse. She hated that he was right. "Fine," she snapped, following him. "But if you so much as relax, Miss Bennet, you're not my type." The words stung more than they should have. They climbed the narrow staircase in silence, Darian leading the way. The second floor was quieter, dimly lit by oil lamps mounted on the walls. Darian stopped at the last door on the left and unlocked it with a key the innkeeper had given him earlier. The room was small, painfully small. One bed, one chair, one window that rattled in the wind. Clara's breath caught. "You can't be serious." "I didn't design the inn." Darian stepped inside, tossing his coat onto the chair. "Take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor." "That's not the point." "Then what is?" "This." Clara gestured helplessly at the room, at him, at the situation. "If anyone finds out I spent the night alone with you, my reputation is ruined." "Then don't tell anyone." "It's not that simple." Darian turned to face her fully, his expression hardening. "Listen carefully, Miss Bennet. We're trapped here because of a storm neither of us can control. We can either spend the night pretending we're strangers and risk someone noticing, or we can handle this like adults. Your choice." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to find some other solution, some way out of this nightmare. But there wasn't one. She stepped inside and closed the door. The silence that followed was suffocating. Darian moved to the window, staring out at the storm. Clara stood by the door, her mind racing through every possible consequence of this decision. If word got out, if anyone saw them, she'd be labeled, ruined. No respectable family would associate with her. No man would marry her. Unless an idea struck her. Dangerous. Reckless. But it might work. We need a cover story, Clara said suddenly. Darian glanced back. What? If someone asks why we're sharing a room, we need an explanation. Something that makes sense. We're traveling companions caught in a storm. That's explanation enough. Not for a woman and a man alone together. Clara crossed her arms. People talk, Darian, and talk ruins lives. Darian studied her for a long moment, his gaze unreadable. Then slowly, he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent a chill down her spine. Then we're engaged. Clara froze. What? You wanted a cover story. That's the one that works. Darian stepped closer, his voice dropping. An engaged couple sharing a room during a storm? Perfectly acceptable. No scandal, no questions. That's insane. It's strategic. It's a lie. So? Darian tilted his head. You said it yourself. People talk. If we're going to survive this without destroying your precious reputation, we need to give them a story they'll believe. And this one works. Clara's mind spun. He was right. She hated that he was right. But agreeing to this, even as a lie, felt like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. For how long? She asked quietly. Just tonight. Maybe tomorrow if the storm doesn't break. Then we go our separate ways and never speak of it again. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't playing a game. He was protecting her in his own cold, ruthless way. Fine, Clara said. We're engaged. Darian extended his hand. Then we have an agreement. Clara took it. His grip was firm, controlled, and far too warm. One more thing, Darian added. If we're going to sell this, you need to act like you actually tolerate me. That's asking a lot. I'm aware. Despite everything, Clara almost smiled. Almost. The storm raged through the night. Clara sat on the edge of the bed, still fully dressed, while Darian settled into the chair by the window. He'd given her the blanket without a word, draping his coat over himself instead. For a while, neither of them spoke. The wind howled. The fire in the main room below had died down, leaving the inn cold and dark. Clara pulled the blanket tighter, her mind replaying the decision she'd just made. Engaged. To Darian Wolfe. Even as a lie, it felt surreal. You should sleep, Darian said quietly, not looking at her. I'm not tired. You're shivering. Clara glanced down at her hands. He was right. Again. Why did you agree to this? She asked suddenly. Darian didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she'd ever heard it. Because leaving you down there wasn't an option. Clara's chest tightened. She wanted to argue, to push back, to remind him that he didn't care about her, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she lay down on the bed, still wrapped in the blanket, and closed her eyes. And for the first time in days, she felt safe. Morning came with a knock on the door. Clara jolted awake, her heart pounding. Darian was already on his feet, moving toward the door with the same calm, controlled precision he brought to everything. He opened it a crack. The innkeeper stood in the hallway, his expression grim. Road still blocked. Another tree came down during the night. We're stuck here at least another day. Darian nodded. Understood. The innkeeper's gaze flicked past him to Clara, who was sitting up in bed, hair disheveled, blanket clutched around her shoulders. His eyes narrowed. She your wife? Clara's breath caught. Darian didn't hesitate. My fiancée. The innkeeper grunted, apparently satisfied, and walked away. Darian closed the door and turned back to Clara. Looks like we're committed now. Clara stared at him, her pulse racing. One lie, one storm, and suddenly, everything had changed. The lie settled over them like fresh snow, silent, suffocating, impossible to shake off. Clara spent the rest of that morning avoiding Darian's eyes. She busied herself by the window, watching the storm continue its assault on the world outside. The wind hadn't let up. If anything, it had grown worse. Trees bent at unnatural angles, and the sky remained a churning mass of gray and white. They were trapped, truly trapped. And now, they were also engaged. Darian had left the room an hour earlier, muttering something about checking on the horses. Clara suspected he just needed space, from her, from the lie, from the suffocating smallness of their shared room. She didn't blame him. The walls felt like they were closing in. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, her breath fogging the pain. This was supposed to be simple, travel north, handle her father's business, return home before anyone noticed she'd gone. Instead, she was stuck in a frontier inn, pretending to be engaged to a man she couldn't stand, with no clear way out. A sharp knock on the door made her jump. Clara turned, her heart hammering. "Come in." The door opened, but it wasn't Darian. A woman stood in the doorway, middle-aged, with sharp eyes and a knowing smile that set Clara's nerves on edge. She wore a faded blue dress and an apron stained with flour. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd spent years observing people's secrets. "Forgive the intrusion, miss," the woman said, stepping inside without waiting for permission. "I'm Marta. I help run the kitchen downstairs. Heard you and your gentleman got stuck here like the rest of us." Clara forced a polite smile. "Yes, the storm came faster than expected. Always does in these parts." Marta moved closer, her gaze sweeping over Clara with uncomfortable thoroughness. She studied Clara's dress, the fine fabric, the careful stitching, the obvious quality. Then her eyes moved to Clara's hands, noting the smooth skin, the lack of calluses. "You're a long way from the capital, aren't you? How did you— your clothes, your hands, the way you carry yourself." Marta's smile widened, revealing teeth stained from years of drinking strong tea. "You're not used to roughing it, not used to places like this. But that's all right. Your fiancé seems the type to take care of you." Clara's throat tightened. Word had already spread. Of course it had. In a place this small, gossip was currency, and a well-dressed woman traveling with a handsome stranger was worth its weight in gold. "He's very capable," Clara said carefully, choosing each word like stepping stones across a frozen river. "I'm sure he is." Marta moved toward the bed, running her hand over the blanket with a familiarity that made Clara's skin crawl. She picked up a corner of the fabric, examining it with the critical eye of someone who'd washed thousands of sheets in her lifetime. "Strange, though. I've worked here 15 years, and I've never seen an engaged couple look so uncomfortable around each other." Clara's pulse spiked. She forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression neutral. "We're both tired. The journey was difficult." Marta's eyes glinted with something that looked like amusement, or suspicion, or both. "Or maybe you're not as engaged as you claim." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Clara held her ground, refusing to flinch. She'd spent years navigating the treacherous social waters of the capital, learning to mask her emotions, to never let anyone see her sweat. She wouldn't break now. Not here. Not for some kitchen woman with a sharp tongue and too much time on her hands. "I don't know what you're implying," Clara said, her voice steady. "I'm not implying anything, dear. Just making an observation." Marta stepped back toward the door, her smile never wavering. "But if I were you, I'd be more convincing. People here talk, and once they start talking, they don't stop, especially about a woman traveling alone with a man who's supposed to be her future husband, but can't seem to stand being in the same room as her." She paused at the threshold, turning back with one final piece of advice delivered in a tone that was equal parts warning and threat. "You might want to practice looking at him like you actually want to marry him. Otherwise, people are going to wonder what you're really doing up here." She left without another word, closing the door softly behind her. Clara stood frozen, her mind racing. Marta had seen through them. And if she had, others would too. The servants always knew everything. They watched, they listened, they pieced together truths from fragments of overheard conversations and observed behaviors. They needed to sell this lie better, much better, or everything would fall apart. Darian returned an hour later, snow dusting his shoulders and hair. He looked exhausted, his usual sharp composure frayed at the edges. His face was red from the cold, and when he removed his gloves, Clara noticed his fingers were nearly white. "The road's completely blocked," he said, shrugging off his coat and hanging it on the hook by the door. "Another tree came down during the night, bigger than the first one. The innkeeper says it could be 2, maybe 3 days before anyone can clear it. Maybe longer if this storm doesn't break." Clara's stomach dropped. 3 days? Maybe longer. Darian moved to the chair, sinking into it with a heavy sigh. He leaned his head back, closing his eyes. "The temperature's dropping. The snow's getting deeper. We're stuck here, Clara. There's no way around it." Clara paced the small room, her frustration boiling over. Her boots clicked against the wooden floor, back and forth, back and forth. This is a disaster. It's weather. We can't control it. I'm not talking about the weather. Clara stopped, turning to face him. Her hands were clenched at her sides, nails digging into her palms. Someone already suspects us. A woman from the kitchen, Marta. She all but called me a liar to my face. Darian's eyes opened, sharpening with immediate focus. He sat up straighter. What did she say? That we don't look engaged, that we look uncomfortable around each other. That people are watching and talking, and if we don't start acting more convincing, they're going to figure out the truth. What did you tell her? Nothing. I didn't confirm or deny anything, but she didn't believe me. Clara crossed her arms, anxiety clawing at her chest like a wild animal trying to escape. If she's suspicious, others will be too. We need to be more convincing. Darian leaned back, studying her with that infuriatingly calm expression he always wore, like nothing ever rattled him, like he could face down a hurricane without breaking a sweat. What do you suggest? I don't know. You're the one who came up with this plan. And it's a good plan, but plans only work if both parties commit to them. Darian stood, closing the distance between them with slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall was measured, controlled. So the question is, are you willing to commit? Clara's breath hitched. He was too close now, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his jaw tightened when he was thinking, close enough to smell the pine and snow that clung to his clothes. What does that mean? She asked quietly. It means if we're going to convince people we're engaged, we need to act like it. Not just in private, out there. Darian nodded toward the door. Where people are watching. Where servants gossip and strangers judge and every move we make is being analyzed. Clara's heart pounded. You want us to… what? Hold hands? Smile at each other? For a start. Darian's gaze didn't waver. But if you can't even look at me without flinching, no one's going to believe this. If you tense up every time I come near you, if you avoid my eyes, if you act like being in the same room with me is torture, they'll know. And once they know, your reputation is finished. I don't flinch. You're flinching right now. Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him he was wrong, that she was perfectly calm, perfectly in control. But he was right. Again. She hated how often he was right. Her hands were trembling, her breathing was shallow, and she'd taken an unconscious step backward when he'd moved closer. Fine, she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes, to hold his gaze without looking away. What do you need me to do? Darian considered her for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached out and took her hand. Clara stiffened. His hand was larger than hers, rough with calluses she hadn't expected. It was warm, despite the cold he'd just come in from, and his grip was firm but not forceful. Relax, Darian said quietly. His thumb brushed over her knuckles in a gesture that felt almost gentle. This is what engaged people do. They touch. They stand close. They look at each other like they actually care. Clara's pulse raced. His hand was warm, steady, and far more distracting than it had any right to be. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, could feel heat rising to her cheeks. This feels wrong, she whispered. It's supposed to feel normal. It doesn't. Darian's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. The corner of his lips curved up just slightly, revealing a hint of something that might have been amusement. Then practice. Clara stared at him, her mind spinning. She'd spent years building walls around herself, keeping people at arm's length, refusing to let anyone get close enough to hurt her. After her mother died, after watching her father retreat into his work and leave her to navigate society alone, she'd learned that depending on others only led to disappointment. And now she was supposed to let Darian Wolf, of all people, inside those walls? Even as a lie? I don't know if I can do this, Clara admitted, her voice barely audible. Darian's expression softened just slightly. Something shifted in his eyes, a flicker of understanding, or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit. You're stronger than you think. You don't know me. I know enough. His grip on her hand tightened, just fractionally. I know you traveled alone through hostile territory when no one else would. I know you didn't back down when I told you no about the room. I know you're scared right now, but you're still standing here, still fighting. That takes strength, Clara. The words hung between them, heavy with something Clara couldn't name. Before she could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Heavy, purposeful footsteps. A man's stride. Darian's hand tightened around hers, his body tensing. "Someone's coming," he murmured. "Follow my lead." The door burst open without a knock. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face Clara recognized instantly. Her chest went cold, and she felt the blood drain from her face. Evan Cross. Evan was a merchant from the capital, someone Clara had known peripherally for years. His family dealt in textiles and had business connections with her father. He'd attended the same social functions, moved in the same circles, but he'd never paid her any attention before, had barely spoken to her at gatherings, had looked right through her as if she were invisible. He was handsome in a conventional way, blonde hair, blue eyes, a strong jaw. But there was something about him that had always made Clara's skin crawl. Something in the way his eyes assessed people, calculating their worth like he was tallying numbers in a ledger. And now, as his gaze swept over the room, over her hand in Darian's, something dark flickered across his face. Surprise. Then interest. Then something that looked almost like hunger. "Well," Evan said, his voice dripping with false charm, "isn't this cozy?" Darian stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Clara. The movement was subtle but unmistakable. Protective. Possessive. "Can we help you?" "I heard there was a woman traveling alone. Thought I'd check if she needed assistance." Evan's gaze slid past Darian to Clara, his eyes traveling slowly from her face down to where Darian's hand still held hers. "But it seems you've already found company." She's not alone," Darian said flatly. His voice had gone cold, devoid of emotion. "She's with me." "So I see." Evan's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And who might you be?" "Her fiancé." The word landed like a stone dropped into still water. Evan's expression shifted, surprise, then calculation, then something sharper. His eyes narrowed slightly, and Clara could practically see his mind working, piecing together information, looking for inconsistencies. "Fiancé," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the word. "Funny. I don't recall hearing about an engagement, and I make it my business to know about these things, especially when it involves families I do business with." "It's recent," Clara said quickly, finding her voice. She forced herself to sound calm, unbothered. "We haven't announced it yet. We were waiting until after my trip north." "How convenient." Evan stepped further into the room, uninvited. He moved like he owned the space, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "Especially given that you're traveling alone, without a chaperone, without family, without any of the proper arrangements one would expect for a woman of your station." Clara's stomach twisted. He was circling like a predator, looking for weakness, testing their story for holes. Darian's hand slipped to her waist, pulling her closer in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. Clara felt the warmth of his palm through the fabric of her dress, felt the solid presence of him beside her. "She's not alone," Darian repeated, his voice dropping lower, taking on an edge that made even Clara's breath catch. "She's with me. And unless you have a reason to be here, I suggest you leave." Evan's eyes narrowed. "Just making conversation, no need to be hostile." "Then consider the conversation finished." For a moment, the tension crackled between them like lightning before a storm. Evan looked like he wanted to push further, to pry, to expose them. His jaw clenched, and his hands curled into fists at his sides. But then his gaze flicked to Darian's hand on Clara's waist, to the way she had unconsciously leaned into him, seeking his protection, his strength. To the way Darian stood like a wall between her and the world. And whatever Evan saw there, it was enough to make him hesitate. "My apologies," Evan said finally, his tone dripping with insincerity. "I didn't mean to intrude on such a private moment. Though I must say, it's strange that Bennett never mentioned his daughter's engagement to me. We spoke just 2 weeks ago." Clara's heart lurched. Her father. Evan had spoken to her father recently. "My father and I aren't particularly close," Clara said, surprising herself with how easily the lie came. "He doesn't involve himself in my personal affairs." "Doesn't he?" Evan's smile was knife-sharp. "How modern of him." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder. I'll be staying here another few days, until the storm breaks. Perhaps we'll have a chance to talk more. I'd love to hear more about how you two met. I'm sure it's quite a story." The threat was clear. He left finally, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt more ominous than if he'd slammed it. The moment he was gone, Clara pulled away from Darian, her heart racing like a rabbit's. She moved to the far side of the room, pressing her back against the wall, trying to catch her breath. "He knows," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He knows it's a lie." "He suspects," Darian corrected, moving to the window. He pulled the curtain aside slightly, watching the storm. "That's different from knowing. What if he tells someone? What if he writes to my father?" "He won't. Not without proof." Darian's jaw was tight, his shoulders tense. Men like Evan don't make moves without certainty. He'll watch. He'll wait. He'll look for cracks in our story. But he won't act until he's sure. Clara sank onto the edge of the bed, her hands trembling in her lap. "This is spiraling out of control." "Not yet it isn't." Darian turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "But it will if you panic." "I'm not panicking." "You're shaking." Clara looked down at her hands. He was right. Again. Always right. She hated this. Hated feeling vulnerable. Hated needing him. Hated that the lie they'd created was starting to feel more real than anything she'd experienced in years. Hated that when Evan had looked at her with those calculating eyes, her first instinct had been to press closer to Darian, to seek his protection. "Why did you do that?" she asked quietly, not looking up. "Do what?" "Defend me. Put your hand on my waist, stand between me and him." Clara finally raised her eyes to meet his. "You could have let him expose us, could have walked away, could have told him the truth and saved yourself." Darian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant, like the words were being pulled from somewhere deep inside him that he didn't want to acknowledge. "Because he doesn't get to look at you like that." Clara's breath caught. "Like what?" "Like you're something he can take, like you're a prize to be won or a problem to be solved." Darian's hands clenched at his sides. "I've seen men like Evan my entire life. They don't see people. They see assets, opportunities, ways to increase their own power and influence." The words sent a shiver down Clara's spine. She looked up at Darian, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected. Anger, cold, controlled, but unmistakable. It burned in his eyes like ice on fire. He wasn't protecting her reputation. He was protecting her. "Darian, get some rest," he said, cutting her off. His voice had gone neutral again, professional. The wall was back up. "We'll need to go downstairs for dinner. The innkeeper announced it's required. Everyone eats together, and when we do, we need to make sure everyone believes this, especially Evan." Clara nodded, her throat tight with words she didn't know how to say. Because the truth was, she was starting to believe it herself, and that terrified her more than any storm ever could. Dinner was held in this main room at sunset, though the sky outside was so dark with storm clouds that it was impossible to tell day from night. The innkeeper had insisted that all guests gather, partly for warmth, partly to conserve resources, and partly because in places like this, community was survival. The main room was packed, every table filled with travelers stranded by the storm. The air was thick with smoke from the fireplace, sweat from too many bodies in too small a space, and the smell of roasted meat and vegetables. Conversations buzzed around them like angry bees, but Clara felt every eye in the room tracking her and Darian as they descended the stairs. She'd changed into a fresh dress, still simple by capital standards, but cleaner than what she'd been wearing. She'd braided her hair and pinned it up, trying to look composed, trying to look like a woman who belonged at the side of a man like Darian Wolfe. Darian's hand rested on the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd. To anyone watching, it looked natural, effortless. The gesture of a man comfortable with his claim, but Clara felt the tension in his fingertips, the careful control in every movement. They found a small table near the fire, and Darian pulled out a chair for her, another gesture that felt too practiced, too convincing. Clara sat, hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. Darian settled across from her, his eyes scanning the room with the precision of a military strategist surveying a battlefield. "Smile," he murmured, so quietly that only she could hear. What? You look terrified. Smile, like you're happy to be here with me. Clara forced her lips into something resembling a smile. It felt fake, strained, like wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. Darian's mouth twitched. Better, though you might try looking at me occasionally instead of staring at your plate. I'm nervous. I know, so am I. The admission surprised her. Darian never admitted weakness, never let his mask slip. A serving girl appeared, setting down plates of stew and bread. Clara thanked her, but the girl didn't leave. She lingered, her gaze darting between Clara and Darian with open curiosity. She was young, maybe 17, with freckles across her nose and hair the color of wheat. Her eyes were wide with the kind of romantic notions that came from reading too many novels and not enough real life. Is it true? The girl asked suddenly, her voice breathless with excitement. That you're engaged? Clara's stomach dropped. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Darian didn't miss a beat. It is. Oh, how romantic. The girl clasped her hands together, practically bouncing on her feet. Getting stuck in a storm together, having to share a room. It's like something out of a story, like fate brought you together. It's certainly memorable, Darian said dryly, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice that Clara hadn't heard before. The girl giggled, blushed, and finally walked away to tend to other tables. Clara let out a shaky breath. That was close. That was easy, Darian corrected. He reached for his glass of water, took a sip. The harder test is sitting 3 tables over. Clara's gaze flicked to the left, and her heart sank. Evan Cross sat with a group of merchants, his eyes fixed on her and Darian with predatory focus. He wasn't even pretending not to stare. He watched them the way a cat watches a mouse hole, patient, focused, waiting for the inevitable mistake. He's watching, Clara whispered, her hands trembling under the table. Then give him something to watch. Darian reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His fingers laced through hers, warm and solid. Clara froze. What are you doing? Selling the lie. Darian's thumb traced slow circles over her knuckles, his gaze locked on hers. Relax, Clara. Breathe. Look at me like you love me. Clara tried, but with Evan watching, with the entire room buzzing with gossip, with Darian's hand wrapped around hers, sending sparks up her arm, it felt impossible. I can't do this, she whispered. Yes, you can. Darian's voice was low, steady, an anchor in the storm. Look at me. Not at them. Not at Evan. At me. Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. And for a moment, the rest of the room fell away. Darian's gaze was intense, unwavering, and something in it made her breath catch. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. There was something real in the way he looked at her, something that scared her more than the lie itself, something that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, he felt it too. The pull, the connection, the dangerous line they were walking. You're doing fine, he said quietly, his thumb still tracing patterns on her skin. I don't feel fine. Good. Neither do I. The admission startled her. Darian never admitted weakness, never let his control slip. But right now, in this crowded, chaotic room, with a lie growing between them like wildfire, he looked almost vulnerable. Before Clara could respond, Evan stood. He said something to his companions, then crossed the room toward them with deliberate, measured steps. Clara's heart slammed against her ribs. Her hand tightened around Darian's. Evan stopped at their table, his smile cold and sharp as a blade. Mind if I join you? Yes, Darian said flatly, not releasing Clara's hand. Evan ignored him, pulling out a chair and sitting anyway. He settled in like he belonged there, leaning back with false casualness. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about your engagement. And? Darian's tone was ice. And it's strange, isn't it? That no one in the capital has heard about it. That Clara's father hasn't mentioned it. That you two seem so... Evan's gaze flicked between them, calculating, measuring. Uncomfortable. Clara's throat tightened. She could feel sweat beating at her temples despite the cold. Darian leaned back, his expression unreadable. His hand tightened around Clara's like a lifeline. What are you implying? Nothing, just making conversation. Evan's smile widened. But if I were a betting man, I'd say this engagement is about as real as the sunshine outside. Clara's pulse roared in her ears. Her mind raced for an explanation, an excuse, anything. Darian stood abruptly, pulling Clara to her feet with him. "What are you—" Clara started, but Darian didn't answer. Instead, he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. The world stopped. Clara's breath caught, her mind blanking as Darian's lips pressed against hers, firm, controlled, and utterly convincing. It wasn't soft or tentative. It was the kiss of a man claiming what was his, declaring ownership, making a statement. And despite everything, despite the lie, despite the audience, despite every logical reason she had to push him away, Clara found herself kissing him back. Her hands came up to grip his coat. Her eyes fluttered closed, and for one impossible, perfect moment, she forgot it was pretend. When Darian finally pulled away, the entire room had gone silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every eye was on them. Even the serving girl stood frozen mid-step, her mouth open in shock. Clara's heart hammered, her lips tingled. Her entire body felt like it was on fire. Darian turned to Evan, his expression cold and utterly composed, as if kissing her had meant nothing, as if his heart wasn't racing the way hers was. Convinced? Evan's face had gone pale, then red. His jaw clenched so hard Clara could see the muscle jumping. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a screech that made everyone wince. "My apologies," he said through gritted teeth. "I see I was mistaken." He walked away without another word, his shoulders rigid with barely contained fury. The room slowly came back to life. Conversations resumed. The serving girl giggled. An old woman at a nearby table nodded approvingly. Claire stared at Darian, her mind spinning, her body still trembling. He just kissed her, in front of everyone. And she'd let him. More than let him. She'd participated, eagerly. "We should go," Darian said quietly, his hand still on her waist. His voice was steady, controlled, but Clara noticed his breathing was slightly faster than normal. Clara nodded, unable to speak, unable to think. They left the dining room together, the weight of 100 stairs following them up the stairs. Clara could hear the whispers starting already, the excited chatter, the romantic speculation. The lie had just become real to everyone watching, and the terrifying part was, it had felt real to her too. When they reached their room, Darian closed the door and finally released her. He moved to the far side of the small space, putting as much distance between them as possible. Clara stood in the center of the room, her hands shaking, her mind replaying the kiss over and over. The feel of his lips, the strength in his hands, the way her entire body had responded to him. "That was necessary." Darian cut her off, his voice clipped. He wouldn't look at her. He was going to expose us. "I did what I had to." "You kissed me." "I'm aware." "In front of everyone." "That was the point." Darian finally turned to face her, but his expression was closed off, his eyes carefully neutral. It's what engaged people do. It's what he needed to see to believe the lie. Clara's chest tightened with something that felt dangerously close to disappointment. It felt real. Darian's jaw clenched. For just a second, something flickered in his eyes. Something raw and honest and entirely unguarded. Then it was gone. "It wasn't," he said flatly. The words cut deeper than any blade could have. Clara turned away, wrapping her arms around herself. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she'd revealed something precious and had it thrown back in her face. "This is getting out of hand." "Then we end it." Darian moved to the window, staring out at the storm still raging. "Tomorrow, when the storm breaks, we leave. We go our separate ways and never speak of this again." "And what if the storm doesn't break?" "Then we wait another day, and another, until we can leave." His voice was hard, final. "This was always temporary, Clara, a means to an end. Don't make it more than it is." But it already was more. Clara could feel it in the air between them, thick, charged, dangerous. Could feel it in the way her lips still tingled from his kiss. Could feel it in the hollow ache in her chest. She'd spent years building walls to protect herself, and in one day, Darian Wolfe had found every crack. "I'm going to sleep," Clara said quietly, moving to the bed. She didn't bother changing, didn't trust herself to be that vulnerable in front of him right now. "I'll take the floor," Darian said, already pulling a blanket from the chair. They settled in, Clara on the bed, Darian on the hard wooden floor, and the silence between them was deafening. Clara stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm rage outside, listening to Darian's breathing in the darkness, and she wondered how something that wasn't real could hurt this much. She woke to voices outside the door. Clara sat up, disoriented, her heart racing. Gray dawn light filtered through the window. The storm had finally quieted to a dull roar. Darian was already awake, standing by the door with his ear pressed to the wood. He held up a hand for silence. Clara could hear them now, multiple voices, male, arguing. Saw them together. Not proper. His hands all over her. Needs to answer for it. Clara's blood ran cold. Darian's face had gone hard as stone. Someone pounded on the door. Open up! Clara looked at Darian, panic rising in her throat. And in his eyes, she saw the same realization she felt. The lie hadn't protected them. It had trapped them. And now there was no way out. Darian opened the door before they could break it down. 3 men stood in the hallway, rough, weathered faces hardened by years on the frontier. The one in front was the largest, with a thick beard and hands like sledgehammers. Behind him stood 2 others, both armed with the kind of casual violence that came from men who'd seen too much and cared too little. The innkeeper hovered behind them, wringing his hands nervously. There a problem? Darian asked, his voice dangerously calm. The bearded man stepped forward, his eyes sliding past Darian to where Clara stood frozen by the bed. That depends. You 2 married? Engaged, Darian said. Funny, that's not what it looked like downstairs last night. The man's gaze lingered on Clara in a way that made her skin crawl. Looked like a man taking liberties with a woman who's not his wife. Clara's stomach dropped. She'd known the kiss would draw attention, but she hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the brutal frontier morality to come crashing down on them like an avalanche. What we do is our business, Darian said, his hand moving to the door as if to close it. The bearded man's boot shot out, stopping it. Not when it happens under our roof. Not when there's women and children staying here who don't need to see that kind of behavior. We weren't, Clara started. You were practically crawling into his lap at dinner, one of the other men cut in. And then he kissed you like he owned you, in front of everybody. The third man spat on the floor. Decent folk don't act that way unless they're married. And if you're not married, then you're living in sin. And we don't tolerate that here. Darian's jaw tightened. We're engaged. The marriage will happen when we return to the capital. Then you'll wait until then to share a room, the bearded man said flatly. The lady moves to the women's quarters. You stay here alone. That's how it's going to be. No, Darian said. The word hung in the air like a gunshot. The bearded man's expression darkened. Excuse me? I said no. Darian's voice dropped lower, taking on an edge that made even Clara's breath catch. She stays with me, where I can protect her. Protect her from what? From men like you who think they have the right to dictate her choices. The hallway went silent. Then the bearded man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. You've got spine, I'll give you that. But you're outnumbered and outmatched, boy. And unless you want this to get ugly, you'll step aside and let the lady make the right choice. He looked past Darian to Clara. Come on, miss. There's a room downstairs with 3 other women. You'll be safe there. Proper. Clara's mind raced. If she went with them, the lie would be exposed. Evan would know. The entire inn would know. And by the time she returned to the capital, her reputation would be in tatters. But if she stayed, she looked at Darian. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched at his sides. He was ready to fight, ready to defend her against 3 armed men in a hallway with nowhere to run. He would lose, and they both knew it. Clara stepped forward, moving to Darian's side. Her hand found his, their fingers lacing together. I'm staying, she said quietly. The bearded man's eyes narrowed. You sure about that? Yes. Even though you're not married? Even though that makes you... Careful, Darian warned, his voice like ice. The man ignored him, his gaze fixed on Clara. Even though that makes you no better than a whore? The word hit like a slap. Clara's breath caught. She felt Darian's entire body go rigid beside her, felt the rage rolling off him in waves. Get out, Darian said, his voice deadly quiet. Or what? The bearded man stepped closer, his bulk filling the doorway. You'll fight me? All three of us? You're a city boy playing at being tough. We eat men like you for breakfast out here. Then try it, Darian said, and see what happens. The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was spiraling out of control. Any second now, fists would fly, and Darian would be hurt. Or worse. She had to stop this. She had to do something bold, something reckless, something that would end this before blood was spilled. We're married, Clara said suddenly. Every head turned toward her. Darian's hand tightened around hers. Clara? We got married 2 days ago, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. Before the storm hit, in a small chapel outside the capital. We were traveling north to tell my family. That's why no one knows yet. The lie came so easily it scared her. The bearded man's eyes narrowed. You got proof of that? Do you carry your marriage certificate with you when you travel? Clara shot back. We left it with the officiant. We were going to collect it on our way back. It was a weak story, full of holes, but it was all she had. The bearded man studied her face, looking for cracks, for hesitation. Clara held his gaze, refusing to blink, refusing to show the terror coursing through her veins. A chapel outside the capital, he repeated slowly. What was the officiant's name? Clara's mind went blank. She had no idea what names were common in this region, no idea what would sound believable. Father Morrison, Darian said smoothly, without missing a beat. At St. Catherine's, small stone building on the North Road. The bearded man's jaw worked. He looked between them, clearly trying to decide if they were lying. The innkeeper spoke up from behind. Let it go, Thomas. If they say they're married, they're married. Not our business either way. Thomas, the bearded man, grunted. Fine, but I'll be watching, and if I find out you're lying... He let the threat hang. Then he turned and walked away, his companions following. The moment they were gone, Clara's legs nearly gave out. She stumbled back against the wall, her hand pressed to her chest. Darian closed the door and locked it. Then he turned to face her. What the hell were you thinking? He demanded. I was thinking they were about to beat you to death in the hallway. So you told them we're married? Darian ran his hand through his hair, frustration radiating from every line of his body. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I saved your life. You escalated the lie to a point where there's no going back. Darian moved closer, his voice rising. Engaged, we could walk away from. Married? Clara, if anyone finds out we lied about that, they won't. You don't know that. Darian's eyes blazed. And when we get back to the capital, and people ask why we're not living together, why you're not wearing a ring, why your name hasn't changed, what then? Clara hadn't thought that far ahead. Hadn't thought at all, really. She'd just reacted, trying to protect him, trying to stop the violence she'd seen building in that hallway. Then we figure it out, she said quietly. Together. Darian stared at her, his chest heaving. Then suddenly, the fight seemed to drain out of him. He sank into the chair, his head in his hands. This is insane, he muttered. I know. We're trapped in a lie that's growing faster than we can control. I know. And the worst part is, Darian looked up at her, and Clara was shocked to see something that looked like despair in his eyes. I don't even know what's real anymore. The admission hung between them. Clara moved slowly across the room and sat on the edge of the bed, facing him. What do you mean? Darian was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough, raw in a way she'd never heard before. Last night, when I kissed you, it was supposed to be strategy, performance. He met her eyes. But it didn't feel like that. Clara's breath caught. It felt real, Darian continued, and that terrifies me. Because I've spent my entire life controlling every emotion, every reaction, every decision, and with you, he shook his head. With you, I can't. Clara's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Darian! A scream cut through the air. Both of them jumped to their feet. The scream came again, a woman's voice, raw with terror, from somewhere downstairs. Darian was at the door in an instant, yanking it open. Clara followed close behind. The hallway was chaos. People were running, shouting. Smoke drifted up from the main floor. Fire! Someone yelled. Fire in the kitchen! Darian grabbed Clara's hand. We need to get out, now! They ran down the stairs into hell. The main room was filling with smoke. Flames had erupted in the kitchen, spreading fast through the old timber. People were scrambling for the exits, pushing, shoving, trampling each other in their panic. Clara saw the young serving girl from last night trapped behind an overturned table, her leg pinned, eyes wide with terror. Without thinking, Clara pulled away from Darian and ran toward her. "Clara!" Darian shouted, but Clara was already there, shoving the table aside with strength born of pure adrenaline. The girl scrambled free, sobbing. "Get out!" Clara pushed her toward the door. The ceiling groaned ominously. Burning timber creaked and shifted overhead. Darian appeared at Clara's side, grabbing her arm. "We need to go. There might be others. There's nothing we can do." Darian pulled her toward the exit. They burst out into the cold morning air just as part of the roof collapsed behind them with a deafening crash. Clara stumbled, fell to her knees in the snow, coughing, her lungs burning. Darian knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders. "Are you hurt?" Clara shook her head, unable to speak. Around them, chaos reigned. The inn was burning, flames shooting into the gray sky. People were scattered across the snow-covered yard, some injured, some just shell-shocked. The storm had finally broken, but the morning felt colder than ever. Clara's eyes searched the crowd and found the serving girl being tended to by an older woman. She was alive, safe. Then Clara's gaze landed on another figure standing apart from the crowd, watching the fire with an expression that made her blood run cold. Evan. He was smiling, and in that moment, Clara knew with absolute certainty he'd started the fire. She tried to stand, tried to move toward him, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Darian's arm came around her, supporting her weight. "Did you see?" Clara started. "I saw," Darian said grimly. Evan turned away from the fire and walked toward them with casual confidence, as if he hadn't just burned down a building full of people. "Terrible tragedy," he said when he reached them. "Old building, dry timber. These frontier structures are so dangerous." Darian's jaw clenched. "What did you do?" "Me?" Evan pressed a hand to his chest in mock offense. "I was asleep in my room when the alarm sounded. I barely made it out myself." He looked at Clara, his eyes cold. "Though I'm glad to see you both survived. It would be such a shame if something happened to the happy couple." The threat was clear. Clara's hands curled into fists. "You could have killed everyone." "But I didn't." Evan's smile widened. "Everyone got out, more or less. A few burns, maybe some smoke inhalation, but alive." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Consider this a warning. I know you're lying. I know there's no engagement, no marriage, no truth to any of it. And if you don't want me to expose you, if you don't want everyone in the capital to know that Clara Bennett spent days alone with a man, sharing a bed, playing at being married, then you'll do exactly what I say." Clara's stomach turned to ice. "What do you want?" "Your father's business contracts, the ones he's negotiating up north." Evan's eyes glittered with greed. "You're going to convince him to sign with my company instead of Wolf's." Clara's mind reeled. This was about business, about money, about the ruthless competition between merchant families. "That's what this is?" Darian's voice was deadly quiet. "You burned down an inn full of innocent people to blackmail her into stealing contracts?" "I created leverage," Evan corrected. "And unless you want your precious Clara's reputation destroyed, you'll both cooperate." He straightened, brushing snow from his coat. "I'll be in touch with the terms. Enjoy your honeymoon." He walked away, leaving them standing in the snow, surrounded by the wreckage of the burning inn. Clara felt like she couldn't breathe. The lie had started as protection. Then it became survival. Now it had become a weapon someone else was using against them. "We have to tell someone," she whispered. "We have to expose him." "With what proof?" Darian asked harshly. "He's too smart to leave evidence, and if we accuse him without proof, he'll just retaliate by exposing us." "So what do we do?" Darian was silent, staring at the burning building. Then slowly, his expression changed, hardened into something Clara had never seen before. Determination. Pure, cold, absolute. "We beat him at his own game," Darian said. "How?" "By making the lie true." Clara's heart stopped. "What?" Darian turned to face her fully, and in his eyes, Clara saw a decision that would change everything. "We get married," he said. "For real. Today." Clara couldn't speak, couldn't think. The world had tilted sideways and she couldn't find her balance. If we're actually married, he has no leverage, Darian continued, speaking faster now, his brilliant mind working through the strategy. Your reputation is protected, the contracts are safe, and Evan loses his weapon. That's insane, Clara breathed. It's survival. Darian gripped her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. We're already living the lie, Clara. We've already crossed every line. What's one more? Marriage isn't just a line, it's forever. Not if we annul it later. Once we're back in the capital, once the danger has passed, we can quietly dissolve it. No one has to know. Clara's mind spun. It was crazy, reckless, the kind of decision that could ruin both their lives. But what was the alternative? Let Evan win? Let him destroy her father's business, destroy her reputation, get away with attempted murder? She looked at Darian, really looked at him. At the man who'd defended her from strangers, protected her from gossip, stood between her and violence. The man who'd kissed her like it meant something, even when he claimed it didn't. The man who was now offering to bind his entire life to hers to save her from ruin. Why? Clara asked quietly. Why would you do this for me? Darian's hands gentled on her shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was soft, almost vulnerable. Because somewhere between the storm and the lies and the fire, you became more than just a problem to solve. He paused, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. You became someone I can't walk away from. Clara's breath caught. Before she could respond, the innkeeper appeared, his face blackened with soot, his eyes wild. We need to evacuate, he shouted. The fire's spreading to the stables. Everyone needs to move to the old barn on the east side, now! People started running, grabbing what few possessions they'd salvaged, heading toward the barn. Darian's hand found Clara's. We don't have much time. The nearest efficient is in the next town, 3 miles east. If we go now, before the roads get worse, we can be married by noon. And then what? Clara asked, her voice shaking. Then we survive. Together. Clara looked at the burning inn, at the chaos around them, at Evan watching from a distance with that smug, satisfied smile. She thought about her father's business, her reputation, her future. She thought about the kiss that had felt too real, about the way Darian looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, about the truth buried beneath all the lies. And she made a choice that terrified her more than any storm. Okay, Clara whispered. Let's do it. Darian's eyes widened slightly, as if he'd expected her to refuse, as if he'd been prepared for that rejection. You're sure? He asked. No, but I'm doing it anyway. Something flickered across Darian's face. Relief, maybe. Or fear. Or something far more dangerous. He squeezed her hand. Then we need to move. Now. They ran. Past the burning inn, past the crowd of survivors, past Evan's watchful eyes. They ran toward the stables where the horses were being frantically evacuated. Darian found their carriage driver, looking shaken but unharmed, and within minutes they were in the carriage, racing east through the snow. Clara's heart pounded with every turn of the wheels. This was insane. She was about to marry a man she'd known for less than 3 days, a man she'd claimed to hate, a man who made her feel things she'd sworn she'd never feel. Clara, Darian's voice pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. If you want to turn back, we can. We'll find another way. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, at the sharp lines of his face, the intensity in his gray eyes, the tension in his jaw that said he was just as terrified as she was. Do you want to turn back? She asked. Darian was silent for a long moment. Then quietly, no. Why not? Because I meant what I said. I can't walk away from you. The confession hung in the cold air between them. Clara's throat tightened. Even though this started as a lie? Maybe it started that way, Darian said. But somewhere along the line, it stopped being about survival and started being about... He trailed off, struggling. About what? Clara pressed. Darian met her eyes. About you being the first person in my entire life who makes me want to be honest. The words struck Clara like lightning. All her life, she'd been surrounded by people who lied. Polite society lies, business lies, the kind of lies that kept the machinery of civilization running smoothly. She'd learned to navigate them, to speak in coded language, to never trust what anyone said at face value. But Darian's words felt true, raw and unpolished and achingly real. I don't know what we're doing, Clara admitted. Neither do I, Darian said. But I know I'd rather figure it out with you than walk away and spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened. The carriage hit a rut, jolting them. Clara grabbed Darian's hand to steady herself and didn't let go. They rode in silence for a while, hands clasped, both lost in thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. Finally, the town appeared on the horizon, a small cluster of buildings emerging from the white landscape like a mirage. Last chance, Darian said quietly. We can still turn back. Clara looked at their joined hands, at the way his thumb was tracing absent circles on her skin, a gesture that had become familiar, comforting. She thought about what awaited them back at the capital. The gossip, the scandal, Evan's threats, the impossibility of explaining where they'd been, what they'd done, why they'd spent days alone together. And she thought about the alternative, walking into that chaos with Darian at her side, bound to him legally, publicly, irreversibly. It was terrifying. It was insane. But somehow, it also felt like the only honest choice she'd made in years. No, Clara said. We keep going. Darian's grip tightened on her hand. Then let's finish what we started. The carriage rolled into town, carrying them toward a decision that would change everything. And for the first time since the storm began, Clara felt something that wasn't fear. She felt certainty. The chapel was smaller than Clara had imagined, barely more than a room with a crude altar and rough wooden pews. The officiant was an old man with kind eyes and gnarled hands, who asked no questions when Darian explained they needed to be married immediately. Storm refugees, the old man said, nodding. I've married 3 couples already this week. Something about facing death makes people want to hold on to life. He smiled. You two look like you've been through hell. Something like that, Darian said. The ceremony was brief. No witnesses except the carriage driver who stood awkwardly in the back. No flowers, no music, no celebration. Just 2 people standing before an altar, speaking vows that felt both completely false and impossibly true. Do you, Darian Wolfe, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. And do you, Clara Bennett, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? Clara looked at Darian. His face was serious, unreadable. But his hand was shaking slightly where it held hers. He was as terrified as she was. Somehow, that made it easier. I do, Clara said. The officiant smiled. Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. Darian hesitated. For just a second, uncertainty flickered across his face. Then he stepped closer, cupped Clara's face in his hands, and kissed her. It was nothing like the kiss in the inn. That had been performance, strategy, a show for an audience. This was quiet, gentle. A question more than a claim, and when Clara kissed him back, it felt like an answer. When they pulled apart, the officiant was beaming. Congratulations, may you have many happy years together. Happy years. The words echoed in Clara's mind as they signed the certificate, as they thanked the officiant, as they walked back to the carriage in stunned silence. They were married. Actually, legally, irrevocably married. The lie had become truth, and Clara had no idea if that was salvation or damnation. They climbed into the carriage without speaking. The driver started the journey back, and Clara sat across from Darian, her new husband, trying to process what they'd just done. We should talk about, Darian started. A gunshot cracked through the air. The carriage lurched to a violent stop. The driver shouted. Horses screamed. Darian grabbed Clara, pulling her down below the window. Stay down. What's happening? I don't know. The carriage door was yanked open. 3 men stood outside, all armed, and leading them, with a smile that promised violence, was Evan Cross. Going somewhere? Evan asked pleasantly. Clara's blood ran cold. Evan had found them, had followed them, had waited until they were alone on an isolated road with nowhere to run. This doesn't concern you, Darian said, his voice deadly calm. Oh, but it does. Evan gestured, and his men pulled both Darian and Clara from the carriage, forcing them to their knees in the snow. You see, I needed to make sure you understood the seriousness of our arrangement, and what better way than a demonstration? He nodded to one of his men, who grabbed the carriage driver and dragged him forward. "No!" Clara shouted, but it was too late. The gunshot echoed across the empty landscape. The driver fell. Clara screamed. Darian lunged forward, but Evan's men held him back, guns trained on his head. "That," Evan said calmly, "is what happens when people don't cooperate. Now." He crouched down in front of Clara, his smile gone. "Are you going to give me what I want? Or do I need to provide more motivation?" Clara couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The driver's blood was staining the snow red, spreading, spreading, spreading. Darian's voice cut through her shock. "If you touch her, I'll kill you." Evan laughed. "With what? You're unarmed, outnumbered, and completely at my mercy." He stood, brushing snow from his pants. "Here's how this is going to work. You're going to return to the capital and tell everyone about your whirlwind romance and sudden marriage. Very romantic, very believable. And then Clara is going to convince her dear father to sign those contracts with me. All of them." And if we refuse," Darian asked, "then I'll make sure everyone knows the truth, that you spent days fornicating in a frontier inn, that the marriage was a sham to cover up your indiscretion, that Clara Bennett is nothing more than a common whore who—" Darian moved. Faster than Clara could track, he broke free from the men holding him, grabbed one of their guns and had it aimed at Evan's head before anyone could react. "Say that word again," Darian said quietly, "and see what happens." The world froze. Evan's smile faltered. His men raised their weapons, all aimed at Darian. "You're outnumbered," Evan said. You pull that trigger, you die." "Worth it," Darian said, and Clara saw in his eyes that he meant it. He would die to protect her honor, to stop Evan from speaking those words, to give her a chance to escape. But Clara wasn't going to let that happen. She grabbed the marriage certificate from where it had fallen in the snow, held it up for Evan to see. "We're married," she said, "legally, officially, witnessed and certified, which means everything I own belongs to Darian now, including my father's contracts." Evan's eyes narrowed. "What?" "You're not blackmailing me anymore," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "You're blackmailing us, and if you try to ruin me, you ruin him, and if you ruin him—" She smiled coldly. "Well, the Wolf family has enough power and influence to bury you and your entire merchant operation in lawsuits that will last decades." It was a bluff, a desperate, terrified bluff, but Clara sold it with every ounce of conviction she had. Evan stared at her, his jaw working. Then his gaze shifted to Darian, who still had the gun trained on his head, finger on the trigger. "You're insane," Evan said. "Both of you." "Probably," Darian agreed. "But we're also married, which means your leverage just disappeared." The standoff stretched for an eternity. Then, slowly, Evan raised his hand, signaling his men to lower their weapons. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Clara said. "Touch us again, threaten us again, and we'll make sure everyone knows you murdered an innocent driver on an isolated road. We have witnesses, we have evidence, and we have resources you can't match." Another bluff, but this one landed. Evan's face twisted with rage, but he was smart enough to know when he'd lost. "You'll regret this," he snarled. Then he turned and walked away, his men following, leaving Clara and Darian alone on the road with a dead man and a carriage they could no longer drive. The moment they were gone, Darian lowered the gun, his hand shaking. Clara ran to him, and he caught her, pulling her against his chest. "Are you all right?" he asked urgently, his hands running over her shoulders, her back, checking for injuries. "I'm fine. Are you—" "I'm fine." They held each other, both trembling, both trying to process what had just happened. They'd faced down an armed man, bluffed their way out of murder, and somehow, impossibly, survived. But the driver hadn't. Clara looked at the body in the snow, guilt crushing her chest. "This is my fault. If I hadn't—" "Don't," Darian said sharply. "This is Evan's fault, his choice, his crime. But we did what we had to do to survive, and we're going to make sure he pays for this." Clara pulled back, looking up at Darian. "How?" Darian's expression hardened into something cold and calculating. "By doing exactly what you said. We go back to the capital. We announce our marriage. And we use every resource, every connection, every ounce of power our families have to destroy him. That could take months, years. Then it takes years. Darian's hand cupped her face. But we do it together, as husband and wife. For real this time. Clara's breath caught. You mean, I mean no annulment, no walking away. Darian's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. I mean, we make this real, Clara. We make the lie true. And we fight like hell to survive what comes next. It was the most terrifying proposal she'd ever heard. It was also the most honest. Clara looked at the man she'd married, the man who'd defended her, protected her, stood between her and violence time and time again. The man who'd kissed her like he meant it, who'd offered his entire future to save hers. And she made the choice she'd been running from since the moment they met. Okay, Clara whispered, let's make it real. Darian's eyes blazed with something fierce and possessive and entirely unguarded. Then he kissed her. And this time, there was no pretense, no performance, no lie. Just two people who'd survived hell together, choosing each other in the ruins. When they finally pulled apart, the snow had started falling again. But Clara wasn't cold anymore. She was standing in the middle of a frozen road beside a dead man, married to someone she'd known for 3 days, facing an enemy who wanted to destroy them both. And for the first time in her life, she felt invincible, because she wasn't facing it alone. They buried the driver in the frozen ground beside the road, using rocks to mark the grave. Clara said a few words, simple, inadequate, while Darian stood silent beside her, his jaw clenched so tight she thought it might crack. When it was done, they took the horses from the carriage and rode double toward the capital. Clara sat in front of Darian, his arms around her to hold the reins, and neither of them spoke for the first hour. The weight of what had happened, the marriage, the confrontation, the death, sat between them like a third passenger. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Darian broke the silence. We need a plan. Clara nodded, grateful for something concrete to focus on. Evan will reach the capital before us. He'll start spreading his version of events. Let him. Darian's voice was cold, calculating. By the time we arrive, he'll have committed to a story. And stories can be disproven. How? We have the marriage certificate, official, dated, witnessed. Darian's arms tightened slightly around her. We tell the truth, or at least a version of it. We were traveling north, got caught in the storm, fell in love, and married quickly before continuing the journey. Romantic, impulsive, but legitimate. Clara twisted slightly to look at him. And the dead driver? Was killed by bandits. Which is true. Evan and his men are nothing more than criminals. Darian's eyes were hard. We report it to the authorities the moment we arrive. File a formal complaint, force an investigation. Evan has money, influence. He'll buy his way out of it. Maybe, but investigations take time, and during that time he can't touch us without looking guilty. Darian paused. And we'll be using that time to dismantle everything he's built. The certainty in his voice sent a shiver down Clara's spine. This was Darian Wolfe in his element, strategic, ruthless, 3 steps ahead of everyone else. How? Clara asked. Your father's contracts, the ones Evan wants so badly. Darian's breath was warm against her ear. We make sure they go to someone else, anyone else. Destroy the very thing he killed for. My father will ask questions. He'll want to know why I'm suddenly married, why I'm making business recommendations. Then we tell him the truth. Darian's hand found hers, threading their fingers together. We tell him his daughter was threatened by a man who tried to blackmail her, that we married to protect her, and that we need his help to ensure Evan Cross never threatens anyone again. Clara was silent, thinking. Her father was a practical man, focused on profit and contracts and the endless machinery of business. But he'd also lost his wife too young, and Clara had been his only child, his only family. If he knew someone had threatened her, he'll help, Clara said quietly, but he'll also want to know why we're staying married, why we don't just annul it now that the immediate danger has passed. Darian was quiet for so long that Clara thought he wouldn't answer, then softly, What do you want to tell him? The question hung in the cold air. Clara thought about the kiss on the frozen road, about the way Darian had held her after they'd faced down Evan's guns, about the certainty she'd felt standing beside him, knowing they would survive this together or not at all. I want to tell him the truth, Clara said. Which is? Clara took a breath. That somewhere between the lie and the danger, it became real. And I don't want to walk away from that. Darian's arms tightened around her. He pressed his face against her hair, and Clara felt him exhale, a long, shaky breath that spoke of relief and fear in equal measure. "Neither do I," he whispered. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence. Comfortable, certain. By the time the capital's skyline appeared on the horizon, towers and spires cutting through the twilight, they had their story straight, their strategy set, their resolve hardened. They would walk into that city as husband and wife, and they would destroy everyone who'd tried to destroy them. They arrived after dark, exhausted and filthy. Darian took them directly to his family's townhouse, a massive stone structure in the merchant district that spoke of old money and older power. A butler answered the door, his eyes widening at the state of them. "Master Wolf, we weren't expecting—" "Prepare rooms for myself and my wife," Darian said calmly, as if those words were the most natural thing in the world. "And send word to my father that I need to speak with him immediately." The butler's composure cracked. "Your wife, sir?" "My wife." Darian's hand found the small of Clara's back, guiding her inside. "Mrs. Wolf?" The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Mrs. Wolf. She was Mrs. Wolf now. The reality of it crashed over her in waves. The butler recovered quickly, bowing. "Of course, sir. Right away." They were shown to a suite of rooms on the second floor. Clara barely registered the opulent furnishings, the massive four-poster bed, the windows overlooking the city. She was too exhausted, too overwhelmed. Darian dismissed the servants, then turned to face her. "There's a bath being drawn. You should—" "Your father," Clara interrupted. "What will you tell him?" "Everything. Or close to it." Darian moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. "He's pragmatic. He'll understand the strategic value of what we've done." "And if he doesn't?" "Then we deal with it." Darian turned back to her. "But right now you need to rest. We both do. Tomorrow, we go to war. Tonight—" He trailed off, suddenly looking uncertain. Clara realized what he wasn't saying. They were married. This was their wedding night, and they were standing in a bedroom with one bed and nowhere else to go. "I can sleep on the floor," Darian offered quickly. "Don't be ridiculous." Clara moved toward the adjoining bathing room. "We've shared closer quarters than this. And besides—" She paused at the doorway, looking back at him. "We're married now, for real. We might as well start acting like it." She closed the door before she could see his reaction. The bath was heaven, hot water and lavender soap washing away days of dirt and fear and exhaustion. Clara stayed in until the water grew cold, trying to organize her thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened. 3 days ago, she'd been a respectable merchant's daughter traveling north on business. Now she was a married woman with a price on her head and a war to fight. The transformation was dizzying. When Clara finally emerged, wrapped in a silk robe she'd found hanging on a hook, Darian was sitting by the fire, still fully dressed. He'd cleaned up somehow, his face was washed, his hair damp, but he looked exhausted. "The bed's big enough for both of us," Clara said quietly, "and we're both too tired for this to be complicated." Darian looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and stood, moving toward the bed with careful, controlled movements. They settled on opposite sides, a careful distance between them. Clara stared at the ceiling, hyper-aware of his presence, of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body. "Clara," Darian said into the darkness. "Yes?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For not running, for standing beside me, for—" He paused. "For choosing this." "Choosing me?" Clara's throat tightened. She rolled onto her side to face him. In the dim firelight, she could just make out his profile. "You chose me first," she said softly. "When you offered to share the room, when you defended me from Thomas, when you put yourself between me and Evan's gun. You chose me over and over, Darian. I'm just returning the favor." Darian turned his head to look at her. "It doesn't feel like a favor. It feels like what? Like the first real choice I've made in my entire life." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Clara reached across the space separating them, found his hand in the darkness. Their fingers laced together, and she felt him exhale. "Then let's make it count," Clara whispered. "We will." Darian's grip tightened. I promise you, Clara. We will. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped across the divide, two people choosing each other in the darkness. Morning came with a knock on the door. Clara woke to find herself pressed against Darian's chest, his arm around her waist, their legs tangled together. At some point during the night, the careful distance had disappeared. Darian's eyes opened at the same moment hers did. For a second, they just stared at each other, both processing the intimacy of their position. Then the knock came again, sharper. Master Wolf, your father is downstairs. Darian sat up, his professional mask sliding back into place. Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes. Clara scrambled out of bed, suddenly acutely aware that she was wearing nothing but a thin robe. I should come with you. Are you sure? We're in this together. That was the deal. Something that might have been admiration flickered across Darian's face. Then get dressed. And Clara? He paused at the door to his dressing room. No matter what he says, don't back down. My father respects strength. Show him weakness, and he'll tear you apart. 10 minutes later, they descended the grand staircase together, Clara wearing a borrowed dress from Darian's sister's wardrobe, her hand resting on his arm. Victor Wolf stood in the drawing room, a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes exactly like his son's. He turned as they entered, his gaze sweeping over Clara with the precision of a merchant assessing inventory. Father, Darian said calmly, this is Clara, my wife. Victor's expression didn't change. So the butler informed me. Care to explain how my son left here unmarried 4 days ago and returned with a bride? We fell in love. Darian's voice was steady. We married. It's that simple. Nothing is ever that simple. Victor moved closer, his eyes never leaving Clara. What's your family name, girl? Bennett, sir. Clara forced herself to meet his gaze without flinching. My father is James Bennett. He handles... I know who your father is. Victor's eyes narrowed. I also know he's been negotiating contracts up north. Contracts my company was competing for. Contracts that, if I'm not mistaken, you were traveling to finalize. Clara's stomach dropped. Victor Wolf wasn't just intelligent, he was ruthlessly informed. Yes, sir, she said quietly. And now you've married my son. How convenient. It wasn't convenient, Darian cut in, his voice hardening. It was necessary. Explain. So Darian did. He told his father everything. The storm, the inn, the lie that became real, Evan's threats, the fire, the murder. He spoke with clinical precision, laying out facts like pieces on a chessboard. Victor listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Darian finished, silence filled the room. Then Victor laughed, a harsh, surprised sound. You married her to outmaneuver a blackmail attempt? I married her to protect her, Darian corrected coldly. The strategy was secondary. And the contracts? Will go to whoever Clara's father chooses. I have no interest in profiting from my wife's connections. Victor studied them both for a long moment. Then he turned to Clara. Is this what you want? Marriage to my son? Knowing what it means to be part of this family? Clara thought about lying, about giving the diplomatic answer. But Darian had said his father respected strength, so she gave him truth instead. I don't know what I want yet, sir. This all happened very fast. Clara straightened her shoulders. But I know what I don't want. I don't want Evan Cross to get away with murder. I don't want to be intimidated into silence. And I don't want to walk away from the man who stood beside me when everything fell apart. She glanced at Darian. So yes, this is what I want. For now, and I'll fight like hell to make it work. Victor's eyes gleamed with something that might have been approval. You've got spine. Good. You'll need it. He turned to Darian. You understand what you've started. Going after Evan Cross means war. His family has connections, money, political leverage. Then we'd better have more, Darian said flatly. Indeed. Victor moved to a sideboard, poured himself a whiskey despite the early hour. I assume you'll want my help. If you're offering. I'm not offering, I'm demanding. Victor downed the whiskey in one swallow. You married without my permission, without consulting me, without any regard for family strategy. So now you're going to fix this mess properly, starting with a public announcement of your marriage. Today. Clara's breath caught. Today? The longer you wait, the more rumors spread. And rumors are harder to control than facts. Victor's gaze was sharp. We announced the marriage at the Merchant Guild dinner tonight. Make it official. Make it public. Make it impossible for Evan to spin his own version of events. That's in 6 hours, Darian said. Then you'd better prepare. Victor set down his glass. I'll handle the formal announcement. You two handle yourselves. And Clara? He looked at her directly. Welcome to the family. Try to survive it. He left without another word. Clara's legs nearly gave out. She'd just been cross-examined by one of the most powerful men in the capital and apparently passed the test. That went well, Darian said dryly. Your father is terrifying. Yes, but he's also on our side now, which means Evan doesn't stand a chance. Darian turned to face her fully. Are you ready for this? A public announcement means no going back. Everyone will know. Everyone will judge. Clara thought about the serving girl she'd saved from the fire, about the driver who died protecting them, about every person Evan had hurt in his pursuit of power. I'm ready, she said. Let's show them what we're made of. The Merchant Guild Hall was the grandest building in the capital's business district, all marble columns and vaulted ceilings and enough gold leaf to fund a small army. Tonight, it was packed with every influential merchant family in the city, all gathered for the quarterly dinner. Clara stood in an antechamber wearing a deep blue gown that Darian's sister had hastily altered to fit. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style, diamonds borrowed from the Wolf family vault, glittering at her throat and ears. She looked like someone who belonged here. She felt like an imposter. Breathe, Darian murmured beside her. He looked devastating in formal evening wear, his dark hair perfectly styled, his bearing radiating confidence and power. I don't know if I can do this, Clara whispered. Yes, you can. Darian took her hand, threading their fingers together. You faced down armed men. You saved lives in a burning building. You stood up to my father. This is just talking to people. These people will decide my worth in 30 seconds. Let them. Darian's grip tightened. Their opinions don't matter. Only ours does. Before Clara could respond, the doors opened. A servant announced, Mr. and Mrs. Darian Wolf. The room fell silent. Every head turned. Clara's heart hammered as Darian led her into the hall. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, assessing, judging, calculating. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Then she saw Evan. He stood near the far wall, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes burned with fury. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected them to come here, to make it public, to claim their place before he could destroy it. Victor Wolf stepped forward, commanding the room without saying a word. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. I have an announcement to make regarding my son's recent marriage. More whispers. Clara's hand trembled in Darian's. As many of you know, Victor continued, my son has been expanding our northern operations. During his recent travels, he encountered Miss Clara Bennett, daughter of James Bennett, whom many of you also know. They fell in love. They married. And now she joins our family. It was a masterful performance, simple, direct, impossible to argue with. Someone in the crowd began to applaud. Others joined. Within seconds, the room was filled with polite, obligatory clapping, except for Evan, who stood frozen, his jaw clenched. Victor raised his glass. To the happy couple, may their union be prosperous and enduring. To the happy couple, the room echoed. Darian turned to Clara, his eyes intense. Then he leaned down and kissed her, in front of everyone, claiming her publicly, irrevocably. The applause grew louder. When they broke apart, Clara's cheeks were flushed, but she was smiling, because she'd just seen something crucial. People were accepting it. The lie was becoming truth in the eyes of society, and Evan's leverage was evaporating like morning mist. The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming, but people kept approaching to offer congratulations. Clara smiled and thanked them, playing the role of the blushing bride, all while keeping Evan in her peripheral vision. He was moving towards them, cutting through the crowd with purpose. Here we go, Darian murmured. Evan reached them, his smile sharp as broken glass. Congratulations on your marriage. How sudden. When you know, Darian said evenly. Indeed. Evan's gaze shifted to Clara. Your father must be thrilled. Such an advantageous match. He will be, Clara said calmly. Once we tell him. We sent a letter this morning? Evan's smile tightened. I'm sure he'll have many questions. About the timing, about the circumstances, about what really happened during your travels. I'm sure he will, Clara agreed, and we'll answer them honestly, just as we answered the authorities' questions about the driver who was murdered by bandits on the northern road. Evan's face went very still. Terrible tragedy, Darian added, his tone casual. We've filed a full report. The city guard is investigating. They're particularly interested in tracking down the men responsible. I'm sure they are, Evan said through gritted teeth. In fact, Clara continued, I believe they're interviewing everyone who was traveling in that region during the storm, cross-referencing timelines, looking for witnesses. She smiled sweetly. I do hope you have a solid alibi, Mr. Cross. I'd hate for you to be caught up in such an ugly investigation. The threat was clear. Evan's hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Clara thought he might do something reckless, something violent, right here in front of everyone. But he was too smart for that. If you'll excuse me, he said coldly, I need to speak with some associates. He turned and walked away, his shoulders rigid with barely controlled rage. Clara exhaled shakily. Nicely done, Darian murmured. You just backed him into a corner in the middle of a crowded room. Did I overplay it? No, you played it perfectly. Darian's hand found hers again. He knows now that we're not backing down, that we're fighting, and that we have the resources to win. Clara watched Evan disappear into the crowd. What will he do now? Something desperate. Darian's expression hardened. Which is exactly what we want. Desperate men make mistakes. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and congratulations. Clara met what felt like hundreds of people, all of them curious about the sudden marriage, all of them trying to assess her worth to the Wolf family. She smiled until her face hurt and answered questions with carefully rehearsed answers. And slowly, gradually, she felt the crowd's acceptance settling over her like a cloak. They believed it. They believed the love story, the whirlwind romance, the happy ending. Only Clara and Darian knew the truth was far more complicated. Near midnight, they finally escaped back to the Wolf townhouse. Clara's feet ached from the formal shoes, and exhaustion pulled at every muscle. You were magnificent tonight, Darian said as they climbed the stairs to their suite. I was terrified. It didn't show. Clara laughed weakly. Good, because I thought I might faint at least 3 times. They reached their room and Clara immediately kicked off her shoes with a groan of relief. Darian moved to the window, loosening his collar. What happens now? Clara asked. Now we wait. Evan will make his move, and when he does, we'll be ready. And if he doesn't? He will. Darian turned to face her. Men like Evan can't help themselves. They see the world as a game to win, and losing isn't an option. He'll try something, soon. Clara moved to stand beside him, looking out at the city lights. I killed a man tonight. Darian's head snapped toward her. What? Not literally, but I destroyed Evan's plan, backed him into a corner, forced his hand. Clara's voice was quiet. The driver died because of choices I made. And tonight, I used that death as a weapon. That makes me complicit. No. Darian turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. That makes you a survivor. You took a tragedy and turned it into leverage. That's not murder. That's justice. It doesn't feel like justice. It will. Darian's hands gentled on her shoulders. When Evan is behind bars, when his victims are safe, when the world knows what he is, it will feel like justice then. Clara wanted to believe him, needed to believe him. How do you do it? She asked. Stay so calm when everything is falling apart. I don't. Darian's thumb brushed her cheek, and Clara realized she was crying. I'm terrified, Clara, every moment of every day, but I can't afford to show it, because the moment I do, people like Evan win. So you pretend. I survive. Darian wiped away a tear with his thumb. And so do you. That's what makes us dangerous. We survive when we're supposed to break. Clara leaned into his touch, closing her eyes. I'm tired of surviving. I want to live. Then we will. But Darian pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her. Once this is over, once Evan is dealt with, we'll figure out what comes next, together. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Strong, steady, certain. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. Promise me that when this is over, we'll be honest about what this is, about what we want. No more lies. No more pretending. Darian's arms tightened around her. I promise. They stood like that for a long time, holding each other in the darkness. Two people who'd built a marriage on lies, learning what truth felt like. Finally, exhaustion won. They moved to the bed, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful distance. Clara curled against Darian's side, his arm around her, and felt safer than she had in days. Clara, Darian said into the darkness. I'm glad it was you, in that inn, in that storm. I'm glad it was you I got trapped with. Clara's throat tightened. So am I. Even though I'm arrogant and controlling and insufferable, especially because of that. Clara smiled against his chest. You're also brave and protective and surprisingly honest when you want to be. Only with you. The words settled over them, warm and true. Clara drifted off to sleep wrapped in his arms, and for the first time since this whole mess began, she felt something that wasn't fear or exhaustion or desperation. She felt hope. 3 days later, news reached them that Evan Cross had fled the city. The guards' investigation had uncovered too many inconsistencies in his alibi, too many witnesses who'd seen him near the northern road, too much evidence pointing to his involvement in the driver's murder. He'd run before they could arrest him. Darian received the news in his study, Clara standing beside his desk as a guard captain delivered the report. He's gone, the captain said grimly. Took a ship south. We're sending word to the coastal authorities, but he's already gone, Darian finished. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. After the captain left, Clara sank into a chair. He got away. For now. Darian moved to pour them both a drink. But he's also ruined. His family's reputation is destroyed. His business is collapsing. His name is poison in this city. That's not justice. No, but it's something. Darian handed her a glass. And we're still here, still standing, still together. Clara took the glass, staring into the amber liquid. I wanted him to pay, to really pay. He will, eventually. Men like Evan always do. Darian sat on the edge of his desk, facing her. But we can't spend our lives chasing revenge. We have to decide what we're fighting for, not just what we're fighting against. Clara looked up at him. What are you fighting for? Darian held her gaze. You. A real marriage. A real life, not built on lies or strategy or survival. He set down his glass. I want what we pretended to have. I want it to be real. Clara's heart hammered. Darian, I know it's fast. I know we barely know each other. But I also know that you're the strongest person I've ever met. And the thought of walking away from you, of calling this a strategic arrangement and nothing more, he shook his head. I can't do it, Clara. I won't. Clara stood, moving to stand in front of him. You really mean that? Every word. Even though I'm stubborn and reckless and nearly got us both killed? Especially because of that. Darian reached out, pulling her between his knees. You make me want to be better, braver, more honest, and I've never had that before. Clara's hands came up to frame his face. I don't know how to do this, how to be married, how to trust someone this much. Neither do I. Darian's hand settled on her waist. But I'd like to learn. With you. If you'll have me. Clara looked at this man who'd started as an enemy, become an ally, and somehow transformed into something far more precious. This man who'd defended her, protected her, stood beside her when the world tried to tear them apart. Yes, she whispered. I'll have you. Darian smiled, a real smile, warm and unguarded, and pulled her into a kiss that tasted like promise and hope and the beginning of something true. When they finally pulled apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. So what now? She asked. Now we live. Darian's hands tightened on her waist. We build something real from the ashes of the lie. We become the people we pretended to be. And Evan? We'll get what he deserves, eventually, but we don't wait for that. We don't let him define our future. Darian pulled back to look at her. We define it ourselves. Clara nodded, feeling something settle in her chest, something that felt like peace. They'd survived the storm, survived the lies, survived each other. And now, finally, they could start living together. 3 weeks passed in a strange new rhythm. Clara woke each morning in Darian's arms, still surprised to find him there, still adjusting to the reality of sharing a life with someone who'd been a stranger just a month ago. They fell into routines, breakfast together, afternoons spent managing their respective family businesses, evenings by the fire where they talked about everything and nothing. It felt almost normal, almost. The shadow of Evan Cross still hung over them, a threat that had fled but not disappeared. And Clara's father had still not responded to the letter announcing her marriage, a silence that grew more ominous with each passing day. Then, on a cold morning in late winter, everything changed. Clara was in the library reviewing shipping manifests for her father's northern operations when Darian burst through the door. His face was pale, his eyes wild with something between rage and triumph. "He's back," Darian said. Clara's blood went cold. "Evan?" "No, your father." Darian crossed the room, pressing a letter into her hands. "He's here, in the capital, and he wants to meet. Today, both of us." Clara's hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. Her father's handwriting was sharp, controlled, exactly like the man himself. "Clara, I received your letter regarding your marriage. We need to speak, immediately. Come to the Bennett townhouse at 3 o'clock. Bring your husband. Do not be late. Father." No congratulations, no warmth, just a command. "He's angry," Clara whispered, "or concerned." Darian moved to stand beside her. "Either way, we face him together." Clara looked up at him, fear clawing at her throat. What if he demands an annulment? What if he says we have to end this? Then we refuse. Darian's hand found hers, solid and certain. "We made our choice, Clara. No one gets to unmake it for us." "He's my father. He can do nothing." Darian turned her to face him fully. "You're a married woman now. Legally, you're under my protection, not his. He has no authority over you anymore." The words should have been reassuring. Instead, they terrified Clara, because if her father couldn't force her to leave Darian, he could do something worse. He could cut her off completely, disown her, erase her from the family as if she'd never existed. And Clara wasn't sure she was strong enough to survive that. The Bennett townhouse looked exactly as Clara remembered, elegant, imposing, filled with memories of her mother and a childhood that felt like it belonged to someone else. She stood on the steps beside Darian, her hand clutching his arm so tightly she was probably cutting off his circulation. But he didn't complain. He just covered her hand with his own and squeezed gently. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "we leave here together." Clara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The door opened before they could knock. A familiar butler, Jenkins, who'd been with the family since Clara was a child, stood in the doorway. His face was carefully neutral, but Clara saw the concern in his eyes. "Miss Clara," he said quietly, "your father is waiting in his study." "Thank you, Jenkins." They were led through the familiar halls, past portraits of ancestors Clara had grown up beneath, past rooms filled with furniture her mother had chosen. Every step felt like walking backward through time. Finally, they reached the study. Jenkins knocked once, then opened the door. James Bennett stood by the window, his back to them. He was a tall man, lean and hard, with silver threading through his dark hair. He didn't turn when they entered. "Father," Clara said quietly. "Close the door," he said. Darian did, then moved to stand beside Clara, presenting a united front. Finally, James turned. His face was expressionless, but his eyes burned with emotions Clara couldn't name. "You got married," he said flatly. "Yes. To a man I've never met, without my permission, without even informing me until after the fact." Clara lifted her chin. "I'm 23 years old, Father. I don't need your permission." "You need my approval if you expect to remain part of this family." The threat landed like a physical blow. Darian stepped forward. "Mr. Bennett, If I may, you may not. James's gaze shifted to Darian, cold and assessing. You're Darian Wolfe, Victor's son. I've heard about you. Brilliant strategist, ruthless in business, and apparently skilled at seducing young women away from their families. I didn't seduce anyone, sir, Darian said calmly. We fell in love, we married, it's that simple. Nothing is that simple. James moved closer, studying them both with the precision of a man who'd spent his life reading people. I know what happened, the real story, not the romantic fairy tale you're selling to society. Clara's stomach dropped. How? I have sources, people who were at that inn, people who saw what really happened. James's expression hardened. I know about the storm, the lie, the fake engagement, the fire, the murder. He paused. I know everything. Silence filled the room like smoke. Clara felt the floor tilting beneath her feet. If her father knew the truth, if he could prove it, everything they'd built would collapse. Then you know we had no choice, Darian said, his voice steady despite the danger. We did what we had to do to survive. And then you made it real. James's gaze shifted to Clara. That's the part I don't understand. You could have walked away once you reached the capital. Could have quietly annulled the marriage and gone on with your life. Instead, you doubled down. Why? Clara looked at Darian, then back at her father, and for the first time in her life, she told her father the absolute truth. Because I love him, she said simply, and he loves me. And that's worth more than propriety or reputation or any business contract you could ever negotiate. James stared at her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed, a short, harsh sound. You sound exactly like your mother. Clara's breath caught. Her father never talked about her mother, not since she died when Clara was 15. She said the same thing when I asked why she married me, James continued, his voice softer now. Her father was against it. I had no money, no connections, nothing but ambition and a willingness to work. But she loved me, and that was enough for her. He moved to his desk, poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. I loved her too, James said quietly. More than anything. And when she died, He trailed off, staring into the amber liquid. I buried myself in work because it was the only thing that didn't hurt. And I pushed you away because looking at you was like looking at her, and I couldn't bear it. Clara's eyes burned with unshed tears. Father, I'm not telling you this for sympathy. James looked up at her. I'm telling you this because I recognize what I see when you look at him. He nodded toward Darian. That's real. That's not strategy or survival or convenience. That's the kind of love that destroys you if you lose it. He set down the glass and moved toward them. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay married, you're going to build a life together, and I'm going to support you, publicly, financially, completely. Clara couldn't breathe. You're not disowning me? No. James's voice was rough. I'm apologizing. For years of putting business before family, for making you feel like you had to handle everything alone, for not being the father you deserved. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. I thought you'd hate me for this, for lying, for marrying without your permission. I could never hate you. James reached out, hesitating, then pulled Clara into an embrace that felt like coming home. You're all I have left of her, and I almost lost you because I was too stubborn to show you that you mattered more than any contract or business deal. Clara sobbed against her father's chest, years of loneliness and longing pouring out in heaving gasps. Darian stepped back, giving them space, his own eyes bright with emotion. Finally, James pulled back, holding Clara at arm's length. But, he said, his voice returning to its usual businesslike tone, if we're going to do this right, we need to deal with Evan Cross, properly. Clara wiped her eyes. He fled the city. He's gone. He's in hiding, James corrected. There's a difference. And as long as he's out there, he's a threat. He looked at Darian. I assume you have resources? My father has been tracking him, Darian confirmed. We know he's somewhere south, but he's being careful, staying off the main roads using false names. Then we need to flush him out. James moved to his desk, pulling out a map. The contracts he wanted, the northern operations, I still have them. And they're valuable enough that Evan won't be able to resist if he thinks he has a chance. Clara's mind began to race. You want to use them as bait? Exactly. James's eyes gleamed with the same strategic brilliance Clara had inherited from him. We spread word that I'm considering selling the contracts, that I'm meeting with interested parties, that there's going to be a final negotiation in 3 days. Evan will hear about it, Darian said slowly, catching on. And he'll think he still has a chance, that if he can get to you, convince you, maybe even threaten you, he'll come out of hiding, James finished. And when he does, we'll have the city guard waiting, along with witnesses, evidence, everything we need to put him away for murder. It was brilliant, dangerous, but brilliant. He might not come, Clara said. He's not stupid. He'll suspect a trap. He's also desperate. Darian moved to study the map. And desperate men take risks they shouldn't, especially when they think they're smarter than everyone else. James nodded. We make it look legitimate. Invite other merchants. Create competition. Make him think he's just one bidder among many. By the time he realizes it's a trap, it'll be too late. Clara looked between her father and her husband, seeing them work together for the first time, their minds moving in parallel strategic channels. What do you need from me? She asked. You stay visible, James said. You and Darian both. Go about your normal routines. Let Evan think you're not involved in the negotiations. Make him feel safe approaching me. And if it doesn't work? Clara asked. Then we try something else. James' expression hardened. But one way or another, that man will answer for what he's done. I promise you that. The next 3 days were torture. Clara and Darian went about their lives as if nothing was happening, attending social functions, managing business, playing the role of the happily married couple. But underneath, tension thrummed like a plucked string. Word of James Bennett's contract negotiations spread through the merchant community like wildfire. Interested parties began arriving at the Bennett townhouse, real ones, offering legitimate bids, providing perfect cover for the trap being set. And somewhere in the shadows, they knew Evan was watching, waiting, planning. On the third night, Clara couldn't sleep. She paced their bedroom while Darian sat by the fire, pretending to read but not turning any pages. What if he doesn't come? Clara asked for the 100th time. He'll come, Darian said patiently. But what if... Clara. Darian set down his book and held out his hand. Come here. Clara moved to him, letting him pull her into his lap. She curled against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. Whatever happens tomorrow, Darian said quietly, we're going to be all right. You know that, right? I want to believe that. Then believe it. Darian's arms tightened around her. We've survived everything else. We'll survive this too. Clara pressed her face against his neck, breathing in his scent, cedar and smoke, and something uniquely him. I'm afraid. So am I. The admission was soft, honest. But I'm not afraid of Evan. I'm afraid of losing you, of this, us, being taken away before we've had a chance to really live it. Clara pulled back to look at him. That's not going to happen. Promise me. I promise. Clara cupped his face in her hands. I'm not going anywhere. Ever. You're stuck with me, Darian Wolfe. Darian smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. Good, because I plan on spending the next 50 years proving that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. He kissed her then, slow and deep and full of promises. And for a while, Clara let herself forget about tomorrow, about danger, about everything except the man who'd become her entire world. The final negotiation was set for noon the next day. James had arranged it in a private room at the Merchant Guild Hall, public enough to seem legitimate, but controlled enough to spring the trap. The city guard was positioned throughout the building, dressed as servants and clerks, invisible until needed. Clara and Darian weren't supposed to be there. They were supposed to be safely away, maintaining their cover. But Clara couldn't stay away. She and Darian arrived early, slipping into an observation gallery that overlooked the negotiation room. From there, they could see everything through a decorative screen without being seen themselves. Merchants began arriving. Clara recognized most of them, legitimate businessmen there to make honest bids. They settled into chairs around a large table, reviewing documents, making small talk. James sat at the head of the table, the picture of calm control. The clock struck noon, and nothing happened. Minutes ticked by. The negotiations began. Merchants made their pitches. James listened, asked questions, gave nothing away. He's not coming, Clara whispered. Darian's jaw was tight. Give it time. More minutes passed. The negotiations continued, moving through each bidder's proposal with careful deliberation. Clara's hope began to fade. Evan wasn't coming. He'd been too smart, too careful. They'd lost their chance. Then the door opened. A man entered, tall, wearing a hat pulled low, a scarf covering the lower half of his face. But Clara would recognize that walk anywhere, that predatory confidence. Evan. He'd disguised himself, but not well enough. James didn't react, didn't give any sign that he recognized the newcomer. "You're late," he said simply. "My apologies." Evan's voice was muffled by the scarf, but Clara could hear the arrogance beneath it. "I had to be cautious." "Have a seat." Evan sat, and Clara saw his eyes scanning the room, looking for threats, for guards, for any sign of a trap. But the guards were too well hidden, and James was too good an actor. "You wanted to bid on the northern contracts," James said. "Make your offer." Evan leaned forward. "First, I need assurances that this negotiation is private." "Every negotiation in this room is private," James said smoothly. "I mean truly private, without interference from certain parties who might want to see me fail." James raised an eyebrow. "Such as?" "Your daughter and her husband." The word dripped with disdain. James's expression didn't change. "My daughter has no involvement in my business decisions. Neither does her husband." "Forgive me if I don't believe that." Evan pulled down the scarf, revealing his face fully. He was thinner than Clara remembered, with dark circles under his eyes and a desperate edge to his features. "They've been working against me, spreading lies, trying to destroy my reputation." "Or perhaps," James said coldly, "they've been telling the truth about a man who committed murder." The room went very still. Evan's eyes narrowed. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" James stood, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "A carriage driver, murdered on a frozen road, shot in cold blood while my daughter and her husband watched. Does that refresh your memory?" Evan's hand moved toward his coat. Clara saw the shape of a weapon beneath the fabric. "I wouldn't," James said quietly. The servants around the room revealed themselves, pulling back their coats to show guard uniforms, hands on their weapons. Evan froze. "It was a trap," he breathed. "It was justice," James corrected. "You murdered an innocent man. You tried to blackmail my daughter. You burned down an inn full of people. And you thought you could get away with it." Evan's face twisted with rage. "You have no proof." "Actually, we do." Darian's voice rang out from the observation gallery. Every head turned as Darian and Clara emerged, descending the stairs to the main floor. Evan's eyes went wide. "We have witness testimony," Darian continued calmly. "We have evidence placing you at the scene. We have motive. And we have something else." He nodded to one of the guards who brought forward a man Clara didn't recognize, rough-looking, nervous. "This is Marcus Reed," Darian said. "One of the men you hired to ambush us on that road. He's agreed to testify against you in exchange for a lighter sentence. He'll tell the court everything, how you paid him, how you ordered the murder, how you planned it all." Evan's face went white. "He's lying. I have receipts," Marcus said quietly. "Payments from your accounts, letters in your handwriting. I kept everything, for insurance." The trap closed like a vice. Evan looked around the room, seeing no escape, no way out. His hand twitched toward his weapon again. "Don't," Darian warned, moving to stand between Evan and Clara. But Evan wasn't looking at Darian. He was looking at Clara, his eyes burning with hatred. "This is your fault," he spat. "All of it. If you'd just done what I asked, if you'd just cooperated, then you'd have gotten away with murder," Clara finished. "But I didn't cooperate. I fought back, and I won." Something in Evan snapped. He lunged forward, pulling the weapon from his coat, aiming it directly at Clara. Time slowed. Darian threw himself in front of her. The gunshot cracked through the air. Clara screamed, but it wasn't Darian who fell. One of the guards had fired first, his bullet striking Evan in the shoulder, spinning him around. The weapon clattered to the floor. Evan collapsed, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face twisted in pain and defeat. Guards swarmed him immediately, securing his weapon, binding his hands. Clara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She stared at Darian, her hands shaking, her mind replaying the moment he'd thrown himself between her and death. "Are you hurt?" Darian demanded, his hands running over her shoulders, her arms checking for injuries. "You could have died," Clara whispered. "So could you." Darian pulled her against him, his heart hammering against her ear. And that wasn't an option. Clara clung to him, tears streaming down her face. "Don't ever do that again." "I can't promise that." "Darian, I can't promise I won't protect you," he said fiercely. "I can't promise I won't put myself between you and danger, because that's what love is, Clara. It's choosing someone else's life over your own, every single time." Clara pulled back to look at him, and in his eyes, she saw the absolute truth of it. He loved her, completely, irrevocably, the kind of love that would shield her with his own body without hesitation. "I love you," Clara said, the words tumbling out. "I love you so much it terrifies me." Darian's expression softened. "Good. Because I love you too. And I'm never letting you go." He kissed her then, in front of everyone, her father, the guards, the watching merchants. A kiss that declared ownership and partnership and forever. When they finally broke apart, Evan was being dragged from the room, still cursing, still spitting threats that no one listened to anymore. James approached them, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes bright with something that might have been pride. "Well done," he said simply. "We couldn't have done it without you," Darian said. "Yes, you could have." James looked at Clara. "But I'm glad you didn't have to. I'm glad I could finally be the father you needed." Clara hugged him, and this time James didn't hesitate. He held her tight, and Clara felt something inside her heal, something that had been broken since her mother died. 6 months later, Clara stood on the balcony of the Wolf townhouse, watching the sun set over the capital. Spring had arrived, bringing warmth and new growth and the promise of fresh beginnings. Behind her she heard footsteps. Then Darian's arms came around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "You're supposed to be resting," he murmured against her ear. "I'm not tired." "You're 6 months pregnant. You're always tired." Clara smiled, placing her hands over his where they rested on her slightly rounded belly. Point taken. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city lights begin to flicker to life. Evan Cross had been convicted 3 months ago. He was serving 20 years for murder, attempted murder, arson, and a dozen other charges that had surfaced during the investigation. His family's business had collapsed. His name had become synonymous with corruption and violence. Justice had been served, and Clara and Darian had moved on with their lives. They'd merged their family businesses, combining the Bennett shipping operations with the Wolf trading empire to create something larger and more powerful than either had been alone. They'd established new trade routes, opened new markets, and built a reputation for fair dealing and honest business practices. But more than that, they'd built a life together, a real one, based on truth and trust and love that had been forged in fire and emerged stronger for it. "I've been thinking," Darian said quietly. "Dangerous." He laughed, the sound rumbling through his chest. "About the baby. About what we'll tell them when they're older. About how we met." Clara turned in his arms to face him. "What will we say?" "The truth." Darian's hand came up to cup her face. "That we met in a storm. That we lied to survive. That we fell in love despite our best efforts not to. And that sometimes the best things in life come from the worst circumstances." Clara's throat tightened. "That's a good story." "It's our story." Darian's thumb brushed across her cheekbone. "And I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Not the fear, not the danger, not even the lies. Because all of it led us here. Here being married, expecting a child, and running a business empire together. Here being happy." Darian's voice was soft. "Really, truly happy. For the first time in my life." Clara stretched up to kiss him, slow and sweet and full of promise. "Me too," she whispered against his lips. They stood together as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. And Clara thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago, desperate, alone, fighting for survival in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. That girl would never have believed this ending was possible, but she'd fought for it anyway, had clawed her way through lies and fire and death to reach this moment, and it had been worth every terrifying second. "Come inside," Darian said, taking her hand. Your father's coming for dinner, and you know how he gets if we're late." Clara laughed. "He's gotten worse since finding out about the baby. I swear he's already planning their education." "Of course he is. They're going to run the entire shipping industry by the time they're 10. Only the shipping industry? I assumed you'd have them managing the trading operations by 8. "Obviously." They walked inside together, hand in hand, still bantering, still learning each other, still building a life from the foundation of lies that had somehow transformed into the truest thing either of them had ever known. That night, over dinner with her father, Clara looked around the table at the family they'd created. Unconventional, forged in crisis, born from necessity. And she realized something profound. The storm that had trapped them hadn't been the blizzard that closed the roads. It had been the storm of expectation, of society's rules, of lives lived according to other people's plans. And the shelter they'd found hadn't been the inn, it had been each other. Two people choosing to face the world together, to build something real from something false, to turn survival into love. "What are you thinking about?" Darian asked quietly, his hand finding hers under the table. Clara squeezed his fingers, her heart full. "About how sometimes the best decisions we make are the ones that seem completely insane at the time." Darian smiled, that rare, genuine smile that still made her breath catch. Like marrying a stranger in a frontier chapel to outmaneuver a blackmailer? Exactly like that. James cleared his throat. "I'm choosing to ignore the implications of that conversation and focus on the dessert that's being served." They all laughed, and the moment passed into memory, one of thousands they would collect over the years to come. Later, when Clara and Darian lay in bed, wrapped in each other's arms, Clara whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." "For what?" "For being trapped in that storm with me, for defending me, for choosing me." Clara's hand found his over her belly, their child growing between them. "For all of it." Darian pulled her closer. "I should be thanking you. You turned my entire life upside down." "Is that a complaint?" "It's the highest compliment I can give." Darian pressed a kiss to her temple. "You made me feel things I didn't think I was capable of feeling. You made me want things I'd convinced myself I didn't need. You made me real." Clara turned in his arms, finding his lips in the darkness. The kiss was gentle, familiar, and still sparked with the same electricity that had ignited between them that first night. "I love you," she murmured. "I love you too." Darian's hand cradled her face. "More than I thought it was possible to love anyone." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, two survivors who'd found shelter in each other and built an empire from the ashes of a lie. Outside, spring rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, nothing like the blizzard that had brought them together. But Clara didn't mind storms anymore, because she'd learned that sometimes the most destructive forces in life cleared the way for the most beautiful growth, and sometimes being trapped was just another word for being found. She'd been found in that storm. Found by a man who saw past her fear to her strength. Found by a love that demanded honesty even when lies would have been easier. Found by a future she'd never dared imagine but would fight to protect with everything she had. The storm had passed, but its legacy remained, in the child growing inside her, in the business they'd built, in the family they'd forged from chaos and choice. And as Clara drifted off to sleep in Darian's arms, she thought about the girl who'd boarded that carriage so many months ago, desperate and determined and utterly alone. That girl had survived. More than survived, she'd conquered, and in conquering, she'd found something far more valuable than safety or reputation or any contract her father could have negotiated. She'd found herself. And she'd found love, the kind that started with a lie, but transformed into the truest thing she'd ever known. The kind that made her believe in second chances and new beginnings, and the possibility that sometimes the worst storms brought you exactly where you needed to be. In the arms of someone who would weather every future storm beside you. Forever.